Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here coming to you from Richmond, Virginia. Today, we're going to talk about Russian logistics just a touch. It has now been 4.5 days since someone, undoubtedly the Ukrainians, did a bomb attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the bridge that connects the mainland of Russia to the southeastern point of the Crimean Peninsula. It is Russia's only reliable rail connection to the southern front. There are rail connections in the eastern part of Ukraine that do end into the west, but they all are reliant on a single transfer station up near the river at Zaporizhzhia, and so they're well within short range missile fire and rocket fire from the Ukrainians. So the Russians have not used that route because the trains kept getting blown up. Kerch, however, is completely out of the range of almost all weapons that are in play in the theater. It's certainly everything the Ukrainians have. And it's not until equipment on the trains gets all the way past Crimea and is actually approaching Kherson City before it comes into range of Ukrainian weapons. So this has been allowing the Ukrainians to, this has been allowing the Russians to disgorge equipment and men, and especially fuel, excuse me, fighting off laryngitis, very close to the front lines for the last 5 months of the war. Now, with Kerch offline, and it looks like it's going to be offline for an extended period of time, they only today removed the destroyed rail cars from the fuel train that got blown up when the bomb went off. And it looks like at least one of the tracks is warped beyond any sort of easy replacement. So replacing the tracks on the section that was completely damaged is going to be a month or two process. Undoubtedly, we also had warping and melting and re-solidification in the rebar and the concrete. So it's entirely possible, but both rail lines that go across the bridge are going to be offline for an extended period of time. But let's assume best case scenario here. Let's assume that the Russians are able to rip up the rails, put up new rails, and that there was no damage to the rebar and the structure of the bridge itself. Unlikely, but let's assume that. It's going to be about a 3-week process. In that time, the Russians need to reroute logistics. Now, there is a 2-lane section of the Kerch Bridge that is still operational, so they can still move things by truck. And there is the option of ferries operating that can go to terminals. And then, of course, there's options of going through eastern and southern Ukraine direct as opposed to going through Crimea. But none of these are good options. There's all kinds of restrictions. Ammo, men, but fuel is by far the biggest one. Fuel is bulky and it takes up a lot of weight and space in any transport medium. And a single cistern car in a truck can transport more fuel than 3 of those giant liquids transport trucks that we see on American highways, which are not what the Russians use. They use ones that are about 1/3 that size. So you're talking about a 6-to-1 ratio just in terms of the volume. And of course, those trucks use an order of magnitude more fuel to move this stuff than a train would. So you're losing a lot on the way. There's also a distance issue. Right now, most of the fuel is coming primarily from the refining and port town of Novorossiysk, which is fairly close to the eastern side of the Kerch Bridge. Otherwise, you're going to have to go to Vrenza or Samara, or if you're lucky, Belgrade, which is further away, and you then have to go through either Donetsk or Luhansk or both before going north of Mariupol into Mariupol. And now you're completely within range of multiple Ukrainian weapon systems before you can eventually do a dogleg over to Kherson. So you're talking about a trip that instead of a day by train is a week or more by a combined road rail system, because you also have to do an offloading of your train at some point. Otherwise, they're just going to blow up the cisterns. The trucks at least have the option of being able to use back roads. And then, of course, there are active insurgencies going on in almost that entire route. So one Javelin is more than enough to take out a fuel truck, and these are civilian fuel trucks because the Russians don't have a military truck fleet anymore. So a Javelin might be overkill. An RPG would be plenty. Small arms fire could do it. So you're dealing with complications here to the war effort for the Russians that are an order of magnitude more complicated than they were. And even if they started redirecting everything already, it's going to be at least another week or two before the first of those fresh supplies from rerouted supplies ultimately make it to the front where they need to be used. Which means even in the best case scenario for the Russians here, the Ukrainians have a window of at least a couple of weeks where any equipment they destroy, any fuel tanks they destroy, cannot be replaced. And if the Ukrainians are going to make a push, now's really the time to do it. Now, if it turns out that this assessment is wrong and Kerch Bridge gets repaired in short order, then that means that the window has closed very, very quickly. But judging from the damage, that is not going to happen this month. Probably not next month either. Okay, that's it for me. Until next time.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Lincoln Memorial in DC. Now I know I've already talked about the Chinese semiconductor shift in policy here in the United States, but there's been a lot that has developed over the last 48 hours, so I feel I need to do a quick update. The biggest thing to understand is not only is China now unable to import the equipment to make semiconductors, or the tools to maintain and operate the equipment, or the software that's necessary to operate the equipment, or any mid or high-level chips at all. Now, any Americans who want to assist with the Chinese semiconductor industry have to make a choice. You can have your job with China, or you can have your citizenship. As a result, within about 48 hours of the policy being adopted last Friday, every single American citizen who was working in China in the industry either quit or their companies relocated their entire division so they wouldn't have to lose their staff. For all practical purposes, the Chinese semiconductor industry of everything over like Internet of Things level of quality is now dead. And that has a lot more implications than it sounds. The Chinese have proven incapable over the last 25 years of advancing sufficiently technologically in terms of the intellectual heft that's required to operate this industry beyond being able to simply operate the facilities that make the low-end chips, and even that had to be managed by foreigners. So there is no indigenous capacity here to pick this up and move on. And since the United States has basically corralled the Japanese and the Dutch, two very pro-American countries from a strategic sense, to join in this ban, really all that's left is potentially Korea and Taiwan. And even if they were fully on board, which they're not, that is not enough to carry all the water that needs to be carried. In terms of industrial follow-on, this doesn't just mean that the Chinese are never going to be able to make the chips that go into cars or computers. It also means that any industry that is dependent upon the hardware dies. So when you think of some of the technological advancement that the Chinese have made in recent years, things like AI and mass automation, monitoring their own population, the Great Firewall, hypersonic cruise missiles, a space program, supercomputers. If the Chinese want to do any of this, they have to buy chips basically on the gray market, purchase pre-finished products, and then pull out the chips and apply them to something they weren't designed for. We are looking at least an order of magnitude drop in the Chinese capacity to operate in anything that is tech-focused. This is a deal killer, not just for the industry, but for a modern technocratic system. From a technological point of view, China is done. The question, of course, is what do they do about it? We are dealing with a one-man government here that's a little petulant when they don't get their way, and where the bureaucracy is either completely static or over-enthusiastic and does things like wolf warrior diplomacy. So I would expect this kind of bag of dicks diplomacy that has evolved in China to get this hard and loud, which will probably only encourage the Americans to act more harshly and start targeting some of the lower end semiconductors. And that's going to have consequences throughout the world, but we'll get to that another time. All right, take care.